Hello, everybody, and welcome to another book club where we'll be going through language of creation. We'll start from chapter 14. Uh, this has been discussed last week, but due to lack of organizational discipline on my side and on Mark's side, that was not uh, recorded. And yeah, since we all want to catch up a little bit and be on the same page, we'll go through the chapters that were discussed previously. Um, and yeah, maybe highlighting some of the insights that has come over the week. I think you guys got up to 18. Is that correct? That is correct. Great. And there's
True.
Danny's internet just like completely destroying us. And um, okay. So one of the other things that I was actually planning to do last week is to pay a little bit more attention to the format, right? So we've kind of been going through things. We've been getting saddled in this idea of a book club, in the way that the book is presenting things to us, and I want to stand still at, well, how do we translate this into our lives, right? So first time I went over to setting this attention. Um, like setting an intention is nice. Then there's two types of intentions. One is for the book club, and one is for your daily lives. Um, and then it's like, well, yeah, like how do you live that out? Like, um, or maybe better said, what is something that you could live out? Because it's not easy. It's not easy uh, to be present in a way that we reconnect these things to our participation. Um, so that's what I want everybody to reflect upon in the first round, right? Like, so what are the things in which reading so far has been enriching your life effectively, and how do you relate to your intention? Like, how are you able to revisit things in a purposeful way? So does anybody want to start off, or should I uh, take the front blow?
Show us the way. Show us the way.
Show us the way. Um, so yeah, I've actually been slacking because I've only been present in the first one, so that's already a long time ago. I have been keeping up with the reading, so I've been going parallel and watching the recording, right? So that's a way to stay in touch, right? It's to reflect on things that happened. And the other thing that I've been doing is I've been having conversations with people here, but also like I went to a festival, and I do use the framing from the book in in my conversation, right? So like I do try to restructure this heaven earth framing, or well, restructure what is being talked about in the heaven earth frame. And so I'm intentional about that having a certain purpose, right? And I play around with it, and so then I can also see what it achieves, right? Like it affords something in the conversation, in the participation, right? And I think one of the major things that it affords is that it inflates, right? Like it allows for more complexity than just a flat world. And I think that's also what Peugeot was trying to get at the first 13 chapters. Like it's trying to present this inflationary idea. Now, from chapter 14, like he starts getting into our role, right? So like now we're in a more participatory frame, or at least a frame from which we could participate. And I think it's important to to use the annoying word phenomenological framing, right? Like there's a way that it's like to be relating to heaven and earth and bringing it together. I talked to Mark a bit about that happens in a spirit, right? Like because the bringing of heaven and earth together is like a zipper, right? Like it's like something coming from above, something from below, something new gets established, right? Something comes from above, something comes from below, and when we're talking about knowing, right? Like I think that is the process of knowing, right? Like the coming together of two things across time, right? Where they're touching, right? In some sense, they're interacting, and both are revealed uh, by that process, although it's asymmetrical, right? The way that heaven gets revealed is different than the way that earth gets revealed, and yeah, there's a bunch of chapters that go into um, yeah, like if you're looking up or if you're looking down from heaven. Um, so that's a way to play with that. Um, and so yeah, like what would for me be an intention that I could set in the week? It would be maybe like drag people in this enchanted world, right? Like that would be like an intention, because it's like it's one thing to know these things, right, or to play with them yourself, but it's also another thing if you can share them, or at least um, share them implicitly, right? So not propositionally, but like that you could show what it's like to live in that manner, and like you don't have to transmit the whole framing. So yeah, now I want to pass it to whoever wants to do his reflection.
Yeah, I guess I can go next. Um, for me, the layout of the book, especially with the pictures, which is just it's not really a book, or it's not a book like other books. Um, if you can see it, and maybe you can't, and fair enough, and maybe going through the book will help you see it. Is all about the tools of allowing the world to become enchanted from your perspective, right? Expanding your perspective into the enchantedness that is already within the world. And that's how I view what's going on. So, in, in light of that, I mean, it's just really still greater engagement with the symbols and the relationships that are mostly, you know, most of the text is talking about the relationships, right? They're the most deeply expressed in the images. But just going through and seeing more of these relationships, right? Because I mean, I've already read the book, but you can't read this book enough, that's for sure. So, reading it again and seeing things anew, and especially interacting with other people because they have different ways of viewing things. Um, enables you to continue the enchantment of the world, right, at a greater depth. So that's still my intention, is to uh, continue that process. Come on, Christopher, you can do it.
All right, yeah. My, I don't know, stated intention previously has been about trying to take notes on the book as I read through it, which I'm slowly improving at. And so now moving forward this week here, I'm going to be trying to like more integrate into conversation stuff, as you guys have been saying there. So that's what I'm going to be working on this next week.
So could you expand a bit about how you make a note?
Well, idea was I'm like historically terrible at taking notes about anything. I either, remember it or don't. And I was decided, so I'm going to like read through the chapter and at least write down like a comment about this, a question about it, or if I can't think of that, then I'm going to try to make like a prediction from what I see here about something that's going to come later.
And has that been working out? Like, is that something?
Well, it's helping me. It's been helping me actually like pay attention to more stuff and organize what I think a bit better. So.
Yeah, because I have a similar problem, and it's like if things don't have meaning to me, I don't remember them, right? So it's important to bind them to a purpose in the notes. Right? So I usually don't write notes relating to the book. I write notes relating to what the book means to me, and so I make a translation into my world. So, Danny, do you want to catch us up? You're muted. You are still muted.
StreamYard muted.
Oh, okay. Last 3 weeks, my internet was really killing my ability to be present, so that was kind of really been inhibiting my ability to connect with the group and get much out of the book. So far, my understanding of its frames is too rudimentary to really have gotten much value out of so far. So my primary intention has been to just try to get it. I'm pretty far off. As far as the utility that you mentioned in terms of enchanting the world, responding to material and individualism to me is very much like kind of a straw man, because I have lots of tools to respond to those things, but I am unable to connect with lots of groups of people, like particularly like Christians that I interact with in person. I also fail to grasp much of the wisdom of the Bible. So that's kind of where I am with this. But really, the more that I get into this book, the more it doesn't sit well with me at all. There's a lot of issues. So I'm not really going to really express much of that. I really haven't for a while. I need to put more effort into flushing things out before I think I'm ready to do that kind of stuff. But yeah, I think it's just a lot of the frames I think are imposing are a lot more complex than they need to be. I think simple idioms and other models I think get the same job done as far as I can tell. So that's kind of where I am so far. And my intention is to listen and to try to remain open.
Can you expand a little bit on what you mean by complexity? Like what direction should I be looking at?
I think almost every point that he derives, I have issues with how he derives almost every thought that he derives, especially when I read the text that he cites. He cites text, and then he says, "I take away this," and then he advances and then he advances to the next point. So I just have issue along almost every step of his thinking. The source that I know he's trained in Hebrew, but a lot of the even just lots of error, even in interviews. Again, I could list many things. I had a page, I actually deleted it because it was holding me back mentally of criticisms. But there's just lots of inaccuracies. But even when I try to just grant and take on faith the point that he's trying to make, I'm having issues. Last week I expressed a lot of this, and RJ had a whole lot of really useful things, but I was not really able to follow it, and we didn't record it. So I'm hoping that if I just stay quiet, I'm hoping these things will just resolve themselves.
Well, so we'll be going through the chapters that you went through yesterday. So if you can just point out things while we go past them, so that we can revisit them a bit. John, do you want to share about your integration, your process?
Yes, sure. My intention for joining this book club that I stated previously is I've already read it once, but I want to have different perspectives to see, have a richer reading and understanding of the text, not just from my own perspective, but getting bounce off others. both in terms of new ideas that I haven't thought about, and also in terms of like getting challenges to my own perspectives on things. So I've had a lot of conversations in the last week, especially relating to gender and the symbolic nature of gender, because of my work with my book, The Hidden Matriarchy, which is builds quite significantly on Pageau's book. So I feel that I'm sort of getting a richer understanding of the book, and so I'm just playing along that process at the moment. Yes.
Have you connected it to your writing as well? Like, is that a process that you've begun yet?
I haven't actually written down things. My process is working things out in my head and through dialogue, both internally and with other people. And that is the way I memorize things. I'm almost living in an oral tradition in that sense, that rather than writing things down, I speak about it. I speak through it, and to the point where I can narrate the content directly. So that's my writing process in general. So when I do sit down, it typically comes flowing very easily. But I do feel that I've picked up things that I want to integrate in terms of the feedback and the second readings and so forth. Now, of course, much of what is in the book doesn't have anything to do with gender as such. Like, gender is just a background concept. You can read the entire book without any reference to gender at all. But I find it useful for me, it's almost impossible not to think in terms of mythological gender. And it does give me this rich understanding of symbolism, because you have the grammar, like the basic structure of mythology, like how it is actually presented, but it also has a content, and without the content, it's just empty. So filling it with the actual symbolism from the Bible is very useful.
Oh. And I wanted to pass it to RJ, but he got ahead of me. Slippery people today. Yeah, so I guess I want to start like stating what I saw happening is in part 3. Well, he also says it. Oh, there we are. It goes back to the human skill, and one of those humans is RJ. Like, do you want to reflect a little bit about your process of integrating within your life?
Yeah, right now I'm trying to integrate the process of having cell signal and a working tech situation that isn't upside down. But echoing back some things I've found that I'm sharing in the landscape of the integration experience, even though it's respectively internal, is I've gone through the book once myself. I've participated in conversations and tried to apply some of what we've learned from the book in several different places. I'm realizing through that reflection that what I'm enjoying most in pursuing in this particular group and this conversation is to bring some of that clarified understanding to others, to help them understand what we're looking at in its own terms, and also, really doing that in the sense of looking to help them get to that first step to see where they would make the second step and what they will gesture at, both as a way to keep my eyes fresh to the material and a way to see things that I have dispositional blind spots to myself. So I've been enjoying that very much, and that's very much been my intention and continues to be my intention.
Yeah, so I want everybody just to take a second to set their intention for what's coming. Right, we'll go a little bit faster. So just step in right when you want to. Just interrupt. Don't hold back. So yeah, like bringing it back to the human scale, the symbol of the creator within creation. And yeah, I think the point of chapter 14 is that God reveals himself through awareness of heaven and earth relating in some sense. That was the way that I saw that. I'll just move on to 15.
Well, I mean, he's also kind of outlining the relationships, right, at that scale. So one way to think about it is, it's not just this, the scale doesn't matter unless you understand the relationships, but also if the scale changes, the relationship changes. And that's why he's framing it as the human scale up front. But he's saying these are the relationships at this scale. Because when you change scale, everything changes, right?
Right, and that gets represented in chapter 15 in the first. Let's see if I can add this. Oh, that's not where I need to scroll. In this graph here, it's what's happening there, right? It's a recreation of that heaven and earth dynamic within the mind of the human, right? Because it's like a reflection. It responds in reverberation of what's outside, right? Like so, there's that's maybe a good way to see the microcosm, right? It's like being impressed by the pattern from outside, and is establishing its own version on its level, in reverberation with those things. Instances of heaven and earth at the level of human experience is the way that he describes it. And yeah, here I want to go back to this idea of the spirit, right? So like the wind of heaven is the interplay that reveals these things to us, right? Like if we pay attention to heaven and earth having a relationship inside us and also outside of us, then like that is where we get to see and partake in it. And that's like a different way of being than being subsumed in it. And then in the next picture, in some sense, there's a translation, right? Like you could say it's informing, but you could also say like there's a translation. It's bringing the breath of heaven, right, in contact, and it's creating something new, right, because it's no longer the original.
Yeah, it's also expressing the relationship between these two things, right? In this case, breathing and nutrition. That relationship, when a procedure, that relationship enables a bunch of procedures to happen. I mean, they're not mere procedures, but and the way you describe that in this diagram is Adam, right? And so Adam only exists within the frame or the context or the perspective of breathing and nutrition, right? Without the relationship of breathing, nutrition, and Adam, there's no Adam, right? There's also no breathing and no nutrition, by the way, because right, so the three are interrelated in that way.
And so here comes the framing that I do like, right? Like the head and the body, right? Like so something is on top, directing, and something is below, getting directed or informed. And yeah, like there's a physical corollary where it's the heart, right? Like, and the heart also is symbolically related to that which drives, right? Like which moves you.
Can we talk about this very briefly on a phenomenological level?
Sure.
I do think that it has value, and concretely so. The image on page 52 at the top, where breathing and nutrition are both meeting in Adam. This will sound abstract, even though I'm talking on the phenomenological level. The function of the nose and the mouth can also, in a way, be seen here, where, of course, breathing comes through the nose, nutrition comes through the mouth. Excuse me. On a different level of scale for the same diagram, and this will come up on page. Let's see. We may have actually skipped past it for the time being. No, I'm incorrect. I just have the wrong page marked here in my notes. But there's another diagram where eating and naming are juxtaposed. You can also do that with breathing and nutrition, and I'll use the mouth at that level, because the mouth both emits breath, takes in nutrition, and emits words. So that's going to sound abstract for the moment. Again, I'm thinking about it and offering it up and trying to make it salient on the embodied level towards understanding some of what the dynamic that we're looking at on this page and the next coming pages is from my perspective. So thank you very much.
Yeah, I want to piggyback off of that for a second. I don't think it's a distraction. I think that if you wanna, and it's a really good move actually, right, is to put this in phenomenological terms. If you just look at that top diagram, right, and we'll go to the bottom one next, I think, because that's super important too, in the same way. If you look out on the internet right now, you're going to see people talking about how to improve your life. And a good number of them are going to talk about breath control and nutrition. Like, that's what they're going to discuss. And so this is a really good expression to, if you pay attention to your breathing, and if you pay attention to what you eat, you will improve your life. And like, there's the map for why that's true. Right? So when you pay attention to what you ingest from above, and when you pay attention to what you ingest from below, those two things you have a relationship to. When that relationship is tended to, you are a better atom in this case, just because that's the symbol we're using. And then to move down below, this came up on Twitter this morning, right? People are confused about information versus knowledge. And the thing that I like about this outline is that knowledge is always an integration of simpler things, right? Knowledge is a complexification in that way. Not that knowledge is necessarily complex, but to inform, right? To form signals, basically, right, is the authority. To express is the power, right? Like, your body is the thing that forces the rock to move, right? It's not a magic trick. This is really straightforward stuff. And the thing that's in the middle that mediates that, he says, symbolize, is knowledge, right? And so you can have authority and power, we'll say, by themselves, right? But knowledge is the thing that mediates it properly. So if you have improper knowledge, that's a problem for both authority and power, potentially. So I that's why it matters what you do in the world. Like, before you take an action, right? We're back to phenomenology. Before you take an action, you should make sure you have the knowledge or the mediating ability to do that action, right? Otherwise, it could go horribly wrong for you, right? If you give a 2-year-old a chainsaw, bad things are going to happen potentially. So don't do that. Even if it's off, by the way. Chainsaw blades are very sharp. Just saying. Cut my hand. Not good.
Hello, 2-year-old.
Pretty much.
So I wanna add something to this, right? So we have the breathing, right? So if you breathe in, right? You take in the world, right? You get informed. If you breathe out, right, that's where you speak generally in the
Yeah.
out breath as well, right? Like that's the expression of yourself. So that's you superimposing on the world, right? And there's also like an element, right? Like when you take in the world, there's a chaotic nature, right? Like you get filled with stuff, right? And then when you breathe out, it settles down, right? And if but you can even say, right, like when you speak from a higher place in your body, like that means that you're dysregulated, right? So like you don't take things fully in, and you're also not able to bear the full your fullness back into the world, right? Because you're trapped in a type of relationship. So yeah, that's a way to think about it. And like I'd invite everybody to just to like actually feel that happening to them when they
Jumped
breathe.
a little bit. So what we've been discussing is going to be pretty important once we get to page 60 or so. That was actually what was specifically in my mind, but backwards to go forwards is quite useful in this case. So
Right. And from my mind, and I don't he's saying that at page 50.
for people at home and in the future, we're looking at page 50, page 52 at the moment, kind of together, and what we're also kind of discussing them in the sense of the diagram on page 60. So,
Yeah, I've been showing them on screen. So I think in page 53, right, he's talking about informing matter with meaning, right? So that's like first you have the spirit coming down, making like a proposition to the matter, right? And then there's, at least in my mind, like there's a response of the matter trying to live up to that invitation, right? So I actually think it's sequential, right? And then that can happen correctly or incorrectly, right? Like that's, and so if you have a baby with a chainsaw, that would be an incorrect application of the chainsaw, while the heavenly principle of the invitation to the baby is correct. Right? You just can't live up to it. And that's important to realize, right? So like there's these things, right? Like these things coming from heaven, but they might be too high for you right now, right? Or like there might be a set of preconditions that need to be met before you can engage with that, right? And but then you have the idea of a sacred space, right? Like you have these spaces in which you set the conditions so that things can happen. Right? Like that's why we're talking about a container, right? Like that's why we're setting intentions so that we can make that space. Yeah, are we good with this? Do we want to move on to 16? I mean, chapter 16. Yeah. Yeah, so I want to highlight that in the opening lines. Like I always have comments on the opening lines, and there's things that haven't been getting into, but God will give you flesh, and that's the thing that we're going to talk about in the evening, right? So that is at the end, and to eat and bread in the morning to the full, and then it goes on, right? And the morning is the starting condition, right? Like it's where you're coming from. So that also implies a sequence, but it is interesting that they start at the end of the sequence in the phrasing. So yeah, I have a bunch of comments on the text that he picked from the Bible, right? So it's talking about rain, which is something that's outside of our agency. People will gather it every day. That's a process of renewal, right? It's also a ritual. It's also in some sense a rule, right? Like we have to do that in order to sustain ourselves. And at the end, there's the word, they shall know that I'm the Lord thy God, right? So there's a precondition, right? Like if they do that, then they shall know, right? Like yeah.
If we could take a look at some of the specific language that's being cited here from Exodus 16 and Numbers 11, respectively. The specific phrase of "in Egypt as we sat by the flesh pots," and just as kind of the contextual setting for what this is referring to. And then the second quotation is, "At evening the quails ascended and covered the camp." So ascended and covered being the words that I'm picking up on here. And I would point and gesture at the being that of eating and consumption, which is useful and helpful given that that's where we've been centered already.
Mm-hmm. So the association with the quills ascending and covering is like a tent, like a heavenly tent.
Right, and a lot of people will, and I guess from my perspective, I can only say fail to pick up on the significance of the fact that the quails rise and then descend, because the manna descends, and then for them that's not reflected. With the manna. The quails are associated as earthly, but they themselves ascend and descend. Quails are kind of somewhat earthly as birds, as they don't fly as much as, say, a duck or an eagle. So the thing that I'm drawing out here is specifically that this earthly thing has the ability to come into which
You
reflect.
cut out. You need to
cut out somehow.
Sorry, is that any better?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's just the quails are earthly, like Cain is earthly, except unlike Cain and like similar to snakes, they have a transliminality. The quails are earthly. They come up, they descend upon, they cover in a not dissimilar way that the manna only informs, only covers.
Right. Yeah, and I assume that they eat seeds from the ground as well when they're on the ground.
And,
So
and if I'm not mistaken, there is some kind of I can only say transfiguratory mechanism of action when birds or other animals will feed on things like bugs and stuff that the human body can process, but maybe not process as effectively, efficiently, etc. There's the science, quote unquote, is not settled on that issue, but the whole thing of the sun feeds the plants, feeds the birds, feeds you. There's a nursery rhyme called Had God Yah, which in English is picked up on as the cat that chased the rat that was chased by the dog, etc. There is a linkage here as well.
yeah, so I think it's important to realize that, I don't know, like we can maybe see flesh as like the treasure or the glory, right? Like that which has been gathered into its purpose, and then that purpose needs to be offered back up to heaven, right? Because I think that's to do with the right relationship. If we don't bring that up to heaven, but we kind of keep it here on earth, right? So like when I see a flesh pot, right? Like that's a wording that we took out, right? I see this thing where just like, oh, we have a bunch of flesh, just dump it in there and we make a big soup, and then like it kind of stays there, right? Like we ingest it, like it doesn't get offered back. It's just like that's just our thing, and we're going to keep it here.
Yeah, can I add something here?
Yeah.
Pageau says that heaven is the seed, like the seed and heaven are the same thing essentially, and so the symbol is heaven coming down to earth. So that would correspond to planting of the seed. So the seed becomes submerged in the earth, and from that, when you have planted the seed, this that has been submerged in the earth, it will then return back up, emerge from the ground in which it has been submerged. So the growth is upwards. So the seed brings purpose to this process, and this process that then points back upwards again towards heaven.
Yes, it points upwards in the sense that that's what we can see, but it also reaches upwards, which is different than the point.
Yes, yes, and it definitely reaches upwards. So there's a direction, not just a directionality, but a movement in that direction.
Yeah, and you could say that pointing upwards would be like the material aspect, right? And the reaching upward would be the spiritual aspect, right? Like would be like reaching for the form, and the shape that the flesh gets is like an intimation of the form, right? Like it's hidden in there, but it's not complete. It's not
Actually,
complete.
I like the word you use there, intimation, because this brings in the point that Mark talks about in the meaning crisis is really the intimacy crisis. Like, so Pageau says that when heaven comes down to her earth, there's really meaning coming from above, right? Meaning is being planted into the earth. So meaning comes from above, and meaning is that like in my language, then the masculine side of it. Now, when it is then fleshed out, intimated, then intimacy is brought to it. So that's the pointing upwards part would be the and reaching upwards part would be the intimacy part. Like you would understand it in terms of intimation and intimacy. I really have to look up on the relationship between intimacy and intimation. I like that.
Mm-hmm.
If I could point one thing out, there is a slight but significant difference in the word choice of moving up or down, or moves down or moves up, as opposed to coming from. And the way I'd like to point that out is a seed comes from a tree, but it moves down towards the earth. So things that come from above, and in this case manna, are necessarily not having certain earthly qualities or aspects.
Yeah, that's the emanation.
Yeah, that's the intonation versus intimacy as well.
Right.
Yeah, and so I want everybody to notice that we've been using words or categories of movement, right? So when we're looking at these pictures which are flat and one-dimensional, they're expressions, right? Like they're interactions. They're not a static thing, right? So like they go gather the manna, right? Like it. There's a participation in the gathering, right? And they make mistakes as well in the story, right? Like some try to keep them, right? Like some gather too much. Like you have to have right relationship within all of these things, because if if you keep your mana, right, you're losing the reference, the context, right? Like you're in a different day, right? Like, so, like, different day, different chances, right? So uh, you should use the chances that are given that day. Like, you shouldn't use the chances of yesterday. Um, and if you gather too much, right? Like, if you gather too much information that you can't process, like, what are you doing, right? Like, that's vanity. Like, you're not relating to the thing that is important, right? Like, you're not following the instruction that God gave you effectively. So
And
let's
to that end, I'm going to depart from where we are in the book.
you're cutting out again.
To what you just shared, I'm going to briefly gesture at how this plays out in Exodus, and just gesture at what we're looking at, the collection of the bread and the manna and all that good stuff, comes in the narrative arc. The next move it actually takes a look at rebellion, and that's the rebellion of Korah. And then after that, there is a return to the attention towards alignment. I just want to be able to place that for those who might be familiar with the larger biblical canon, but also, although less directly.
You're cutting out again.
I'll stop there for the moment, but I just want to point out that there's a relationship here between looking at where things come from and move to understanding rebellion itself, which is not necessarily captured here in the text. It's implicit here in the text, and I'm happy to draw that out as we come to it.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, like, I think one of the things when we were thinking about intentions and stuff like that, that's the level where we at least I lack relationship to, right? Like, how are these things connecting on bigger patterns, right? Like, what's the sequence in which they occur, and how does that recontextualize what we've been doing, right? Like, because I think when Danny is articulating his reservations, right? Like, my response to the reservations was like, he's not trying to derive things from the text. He's using the text to fulfill his purpose, which is like, yeah, that's risky, but he's not justifying his position. He's just saying, no, I see this in what's happening in the Bible. Like, I don't think it's more than that. Yeah, chapter 17, Adam as mediator. So I want to bring in this idea of a bridge, right? So mediator is also a facilitator in some sense, right? Like, so now that's an act of service, right? Like, you're doing something for something else, right? And I guess with the explicit purpose of bringing the flesh in right relationship, right? And like, that's back to the glory, right? So if these seeds land in the right way and they find the body, then that's good. Like, that's just inherently good, and that's why the service is given. Now going. Sorry, I'm getting an echo.
Sorry, guys. I'm trying a different mic.
Okay. Well, you're getting an echo right there. So I want to go to this graph because I'm skipping ahead. Well, not ahead. this idea of the angels, uh, they have like a relationship, and I presented this process, the going down of the angels, the messengers, right? They need a place, right? And like I'd argue that's possession, right? So you align yourself with the angel, and they take you over, or you serve them in a certain way so that you get to express whatever they're providing, right? Another word is maybe channeling. And the way that you do that, right? Like he's using the word naming there. I use the word shepherd, right? Like especially in relationship to animals, you shepherd animals, right? So you take authority over them, right? Like while you receive the authority from the angel, you express the authority through shepherding creation. And then these animals get eaten, right? Or they get consumed, right? Like, I connected that to experience, like there's a maybe the creation of quality. Maybe that also maps that this, I don't know, like maybe the left side is more related to quantity and this right side is related to quality, and the connection of feeding the angels, right? Or like offering up to heaven, right? Like that would be worship. Like so I see the returning to God, or the appreciation of God, like I would connect it to worship. Well, the left side, right? Like the asking of God, or the understanding God, like literally standing under, right? Like that would be more associated with prayer. So yeah, maybe you guys want to slap me around on this one.
No, but I think one of the things that RJ pointed out on the last recording was that we've got this relationship with these images where he turns them sometimes, so you're looking at them from a completely different perspective, right? Because it's a piece of paper, right? It's very hard to express 3 dimensions, and understanding that the center in this case is the relationship to the human, I think is, helps you to understand what's actually going on. That's my argument.
So, guys, this spent a little bit of time last week. I'm not sure how to briefly examine the change in perspective on this diagram. If anybody would like to take a shot first, maybe that doing it through dialogue would be a good way to do this. But this is what I was referring to in my earlier comments about how being juxtaposed here.
Yeah, you're gaining the audio over time, so I don't know. But is the diagram the one that I'm displaying on page 60? Is that the one that we want to talk about?
Yeah. This is the diagram I'm referring to.
Okay.
So
yeah.
yeah, the angels in this case are at the top. The animals are at the bottom of the hierarchy in this case, right? And the humans are in the middle, but it's further divided, right? So heaven is expressed with the white, and the earth is expressed with, or material is expressed with the black, right? But you can see the inverse relationship in the inner circle, right? But it's related to the actions, right? So the human, the host, is feeding, right, the animals, right? And then for that responsibility or privilege, or however you want to frame it, he gets to name and eat them. And in a relationships are expressed by the arrows as to where the flow of this process is. So what this diagram for me is doing is expressing, we'll say, two different dimensions at the same time. That's why there's the double circles and the arrows, right? Which is the flip of where the higher and lower interact at different perspectives. So I think that's what's actually happening there, right? Because you can't, the world isn't cleanly divisible between light and dark, right? Between heaven and earth, right? Because there's a mediator. And the interesting thing for me about mediators in particular is that they do not participate the way everybody else participates. And they typically take on a responsibility that no one else has. And because they take on that responsibility, they're conveyed certain extra privileges, right? But they're earning those privileges through the interaction. And it's very hard to understand that, right? If your worldview is things at the top and things at the bottom, right? Because the mediator is the thing that takes two things that aren't together and tries to unite them. And so mediators by design have to play both sides. Like that's the role of the mediator, is to play both sides. Hopefully that helps.
Yeah. So
there's a key word I'd like to just raise up, which is or maybe even a suffix, which is the suffix of inter, and being interrelated and interpersonal. It is like the seed coming from the tree. What we're looking at here is seeing how some things, microcosms especially, are not purely from above and purely made up of things that are purely from above and purely from below. And I would like for those who are familiar just with the image of yin and yang to try to see this in the image, the black dot in the yang and the white dot in the yin, being in that space where you're seeing naming and eating next to each other. Things that would usually be top and bottom. We're looking at how some things from perhaps, as opposed to a y-axis and an x-axis, this diagram is actually approaching things from the z-axis. So we're looking at a cross section here. Is this mic better?
Yep.
Yeah.
So far, so good.
So the way that I see it, right, to bring back the word bridge, right, or in other words, translator as well, right? Like, so I think every arrow is a translation, right? Like it's a transfer from one realm to another, right? Like, and that's the white and the dark, right? Like, so the light and the dark, right? So the light thing is the seed, right? Like something that moves, right? And then the dark thing is that which responds, right? Like, and so if I look at the left side, right, like there's three translations, right? Like, so one is from the messenger to meaning in the human, right? And then the human translate that in himself into action, right? And the action, which is the bottom side, now he's acting as if heaven, right, for the animals, right? So I see that as well, he's placing seeds for the animals, right? He's giving instructions for them to follow, like he's putting boundaries within which they can act and cannot act, stuff like that, right? And like, so that side is pretty clear to me. The right side is kind of like the giving back, right? But now we're getting into asymmetry, right? So there has been given body, right? And in the having been given body, something gets shown, right? Like that's why I use the word glory, and it's like a provision. Like maybe that's why like, because I still have an issue with the feeding the angels, right? But it's like when you eat an animal, right? Like that's kind of the justification for naming it and like putting all the effort in. Um, if you're feeding the angels, like that's probably a justification for being a good shepherd or something, right? Like it's kind of like being judged, like knowing you're doing the right thing. Like did something like you've proven yourself with the fruits of your labor to have been yeah, a good shepherd. Um, and in that sense, like that also affirms the angels, right, or justifies them. Like maybe that's it, right? Like it allows you to recognize that heaven is true to you as well.
If I could just tack on uh, the giving and the receiving, much like the functions of the mouth that I referred to earlier, or even of the nose, uh, the microcosm does have asymmetries, but they're reflective of the function of the modality that's being examined. So in this case, I would say we're looking at the modality of Adam, but also the mouth shares this dynamic with Adam. Uh, so you can look at microcosms at scale. And that's important to do, I think, as we pursue this text.
Yes, and I think there's two functionalities of making that move, right? Like so, there's what you're talking about is like the fractal truth that exists, and we can attune ourselves to that, right? And that invites understanding to the truth on more hidden layers, right? Like it gives us a way to connect to them. Um, but also, I think it's important just to train the muscle of making that movement through these different ways different layers of practicality, right? And like what are the things that we can take from one level to another, and what are the things that should remain, and like how do we kind of distinguish between those, right? And I think uh, I don't know what the word that you were using, but it's like a relational dynamic, right? Like it's like a system, right? Like it's like a loose container for interaction. So we can't pin them down too much, these containers, right? But we can move with them, right? Like to go back to this idea of movement, and within the recognition of the movement, we can make the same movement on different levels. I don't know if this is getting too abstract, but I think that's the proper way to relate to it.
Well, I think that's actually useful when we're feeling too abstract to return to the specific diagram. But I'd also like to invite anybody else who has any thoughts on this.
I can just add one thing, which is that in the technical meaning of translate in mathematics is to move or shift position. So it's lateral movement, translateral. So to translation in the linguistic sense that you're talking about, corresponds to precisely this motion. So that's a perfectly natural way to read it.
Yeah, I like that because like it brings up like when you translate something, you assume a different perspective, right? And then you unfold the same situation from that perspective. Like I think that's the mathematical.
Right? Can we pick apart or juxtapose or whatever word we want to choose? Translate versus relate. Going back to some of my original comments in the first session about how I choose the word relate, and the reason in part why I do that is because, as the quip goes, truth does not live in a book.
Mhm. Well, I think what we're talking about when we have a system like displayed there, that's a relation, right? Like it's describing a relation. And so the translation is where the relations get applied, right? So
No,
that's why.
no. The fundamental difference between translate and relate is your involvement in the thing. Okay. So if you are translating, you are above the thing and you are determining the relations. Whether you're manipulating them or not is not relevant, right? Because you're claiming a perspective and you're claiming an authority, and that is what allows the translation. Okay. To relate means you're involved, like you're in that thing. And that's the important part, right? Is where am I with this other thing? And that's why in some ways, this diagram is a translation, to RJ's excellent point, into Z space, right? That third dimensional perspective of the previous diagrams, right? With some added information for sure, but and it is combining perspectives, which is very tricky. I think that's where people get caught up, right? Because they look at a two-dimensional image and they think it only represents two dimensions, right? And so if you don't understand, to your point, RJ, the difference between translate, which is something you are imposing upon something within your perspective from the outside, and relate, which is where you're understanding your relationship, right? So it goes back to this domicide concept. That's very important, because part of understanding this text is understanding that you're not the person that has the option to translate arbitrarily whatever you want. And so the angels, and I think you sort of touched on this, Manuel, although I didn't quite follow all of it. When you encounter an angel, you can't see the totality of an angel because it's above you, right? Like I can't see the totality of the planet Earth because I'm on it, right? And even if you're in space, you don't see the totality of the planet Earth, guys. I hate to break it to you. That doesn't solve the problem. What you see is whatever circle happens to be within your view, right? And the rest of the planet, which is actually a little bit more than half, don't want to get into why, is not visible to you, right? And so what you see is a map, and all maps are translations. When you come back down from your silly rocket ship that you're never going to be in, by the way, just to let you know, you're not going to have that perspective, whether or not it exists. That's important to know. Then you can understand how you relate to the things above you, right? Whether it's the sun, or whether it's an angel, or whether it's an astronaut, right? Because technically, for a while at least, they're above you, right? And that's the difference between translate and relate. And translate isn't always something that you do, right? Because your ability to understand something from a perspective is always a translation, right? And you don't always have control over that. So an astronaut on the space station actually does not have control over which side of the Earth he's seeing and what he's missing, because whichever side of the Earth you're seeing, you're missing all the stuff on the other side, and you don't even know what that is. And you have no control over that because that stuff is happening and you are translating your perspective. right? So it's not entirely up to you. You are not the author, right? The author in this book seems to be the creator. That seems to me to be the best way to understand that. And once you understand that you are subject to the creator and all of the creations, then you can better contextualize this text, I think.
Would you guys be okay if I threw up an image on screen to the point that we're discussing right now? Both and thank you, Mark. That was put very well,
Sure.
and did capture what I was saying. So thank you. So let's see if I can turn the screen around here. You know what? I'm just gonna turn my phone around. See if I can do it this way. Are you guys seeing the image that's labeled Heaven, Earth, and Union?
I have that image. I can.
Yep.
Okay, if we could throw that image up, and then also, for the time being, I'll place this image of yin and yang, just so that we can have an actual image of it to my earlier point, and to actually see that articulation around the space. Now that would be actually discussed differently in text as opposed to this, as opposed to this. So that's both very concrete and abstract, and I appreciate you guys giving me the grace and space to try to make this point concrete.
Okay, let's see if I can make this work. Yeah, so I want to invite others to hop in, like, since we're talking about this. Here.
Also, since we're looking at this specific image, I do have to say thank you to Ignacio over on the Discord. So thank you so much. If you see this, Ignacio, if not, still props where props is due is appropriate.
Yeah, it's a really nice expression of the effective perspective on what's available to you, right? And like, maybe you never have the heaven perspective, right? Or maybe you never have the union perspective. Right? Maybe all that's available to you is the earth perspective. And I just want to highlight too, the yin and the yang is making exactly the same point as the earlier diagram, which is man as mediator, right? Or man as the union of heaven and earth. Like that's what the yin yang symbolizes in the East. It symbolizes more than that, but it also symbolizes that. And then so understanding again that there's really no difference, right? Other than what symbols they're using, but the point is quite the same, I think, is to RJ's point.
If I could just quibble and in a lighthearted way, it's not that there's no difference, it's that there's no problem.
That's better. Thank you.
Well, so I think the difference is in the relations, right? Like, or the implications, not so much in
the expression.
recognition.
It's the expression. So Easterners think different, right? There's a Geography of Thought, great book. They think different, and so the way they perceive relations is just functionally different from the way Westerners perceive relations. And there's no way around that. Like, sorry, it just is what it is. But again, to RJ's point, it's not a problem. That is true. It's a feature, not a bug, right? And so there's nothing to solve there or change or try to change. There's no reason to do anything about it. You just accept that is the case. Enjoy the symbols that make, that align with your culture, because you're, for better or for worse, whether you like it or not getting out of the happening that happened to you as you grew up, the culture that you were in, and move forward from there. Because people get a lot of caught up with, well, I want to understand the perspective of it. What if you can't ever? Because that's almost certainly true in most cases.
Well, and like, what if you can't even understand the perspective that you've been given from your culture? Like, because like when we go back to this heaven and earth and union thing, like if you're the astronaut and you're looking from heaven to the forest. Like, how do you sense make on that? Like what is meaningful in a bunch of trees clustered? If you can't move through them, like you're too far to see the details of the individual trees. Like what is your relationship there? Like how do you hold yourself? Like it's not obvious, right? Like, and in the union, right, it's like, okay, but like that only makes sense if I start walking among the trees that they're like in a foresty thing, and like they're next to the field, and like they're in relationship, this these things, yeah, like they require a certain participation, they require a purpose, right, to be intelligible, right? Because like you can explain every perspective in like an infinite manner of ways, like.
So what we're hitting upon here, and I don't have the right adjective for it, is some kind of breakage. There's some kind of breakage when someone has never been in the woods to being able to understand the image we were had on screen a moment ago, and it's a similar kind of breakage to the translation problem per se, whether that's in space or in language. And what I mean by language is moving from one language to another. And when you are trying to describe attributes from one diagram on one page in the book at using the perspective or lens of another, you have to engage in some kind of translation, which brings into the issue of intention and translation, and that's quite tricky.
I think I have something that I can add here. We modern humans are used to satellites and we're used to airplanes, so we are actually used to seeing things from above. But seeing things from above is profoundly unique and new in modern history. And if we go back in time, they had maps of the world, and they were displaying the maps as seen from above, even though they could not actually be from above. They saw themselves as like these, like God's perspective, if you like, seeing the world as someone from heaven looking down would see it. And that, so any map from the 15th century or whatever, like they didn't have airplanes back then, but that's how they envisioned maps. So that's the viewpoint from above, which is like the masculine viewpoint. Like, so maps in that sense is masculine, and it gives meaning to the terrain. However, seen from below gives intimate knowledge. You know the area intimately. So that gives the feminine version of meaning, as Mark likes to point out. So when you have been walking in the woods all your life, you may have never seen it from above, but you feel that you know them intimately, the forests. And so that is a different kind of map, and it's like you're, in one sense, you're mapping out, but it's relational. It's not this directional kind of thing. So I thought that was interesting, and I could also point out that the Copernican revolution was a shift from the geocentric viewpoint, seeing the world from the Earth outward, to shifting to see the whole solar system from above, where you're looking down on the solar system plane, the ecliptic plane. So they're just making the map transition that they did with sea maps and world maps, Earth maps, to a higher level. So that is really what the Copernican revolution was, just maps applied to the heavens, in one sense.
If I could tack on something in that same vein and bring it back to the object of communication, as it were, the top-downness worldview that this current level of technology has made implicit to the current experience also introduces in the same vein the parasocial relationship. So what I'm gesturing at is I could watch all of Mark's videos and feel like I know him, especially when I see him in conversation. But if I've never met Mark and I've never talked to Mark, and then I go and meet Mark, I have a lot of top down information on Mark, and that's going to actually implicitly impact and express in how I relate to him. And a way I've experienced this in other ways, and I'll point to the aphorism of never meet your never meet your idols, or never meet your heroes, actually. So again, gesturing at the parasocial relationality of celebrity, and in other ways, because social media offers this to us as well.
I can also
I'm sure a lot of people will be familiar with the idea or concept of social media stalking someone they've recently met and have interest in.
I can relate this also back to Genesis, the notion of the garments of skin, because this viewpoint from a satellite is not actually the viewpoint from heaven, but the viewpoint from sky. So, and we've achieved what was before was the viewpoint from heaven has now become the viewpoint from sky because of the garments of skin, which has created another layering between heaven and earth. So that cover, the word sky and skin have the same the Indo-European origins. Both have the same root, skin and sky, and it means cover. So it's something that covers the earth, or a covering. So that's the garments of skin. That's sky. You could say even garments of sky. So the satellites, in this case, are the garments of sky or skin.
Can we relate that a bit more tightly to the specific diagrams we've seen or are looking at? Like where do you see that as expressing in the diagram? Is it in the border? Is it in the arrangement? Could you explore that a little bit for us?
He has this trinity, like a ternary division, like this, like it's not a complete dual division. He divides this into three parts, like heaven and the ultimate cosmos, and the ordering principle, right? That's the source of order, cosmos, and then the source of potentiality, ultimate potentiality, that's the chaos or the void. And in between, that is the symbolic, that is the third layer, the meeting of heaven and earth. And in that layer is where all that third thing happens. That is where sky lives, the cover. So I would relate it to that he's dividing the world into three, like heaven, earth, and the meeting in between.
So to use the crazy example of the spinner, because I can, oh man, I hate this setup. Okay, now I can. So if you see this circle, right, and it's like a spiral that allows things to come in and come out, right, and then you have Adam in the center and you have heaven and earth like outside effectively, right? Like you can see the spiral as a skin, right? That translates or transforms is probably the better word than translating. It transforms the information through filtering it, right? So if you look at the atmosphere, right, like the sun comes in, like it blocks a bunch of light, and it also refracts a bunch of other light, right? So like it actually changes what comes in, but it's still recognizable. Like science reconstructs, right? It can unrefracture it and like get the original signal. And in some sense, we're trying to do that as well when we're trying to figure out what's in heaven, right? Like so there's this fleshly aspect, right, which captures something from heaven, right? And there's an intimation again, right? Like it it invites you to figure out what is actually up there. And like obviously we're not going to be able to see that when we look at something once, right? But like if you have seen all of Mark's videos, right, like you can see something of the essence of Mark, right? And that will allow you to relate to him better, at least if you can make meaning out of it. Because if you can't make meaning out of it, like you can't translate it into action, right? You can't name it properly, right? You can't give instructions to what like needs to happen with your body when you're relating to Mark. And and then you yeah, like that kind of is the conflict that we're in, right? Like so the way I see it is like if we don't recognize heaven and love, we we can like be intimate with the forest, but we'll just be dummies, right? And like when the weather comes, we're screwed, right? Like you need to have the top down overview, not because that allows you to do the things in the forest because you can just do the things by doing them, right? Like you need it because you want to integrate a bunch of things and have them harmonize together into a good life. And I think
Right.
that's the purpose of this framing.
Yeah. Well, I was thinking also that the Earth perspective is the only thing you have there that's relational. The other two things are translations. You only relate to the forest from the Earth perspective there. The union and the heaven, those are kind of translations for
Um,
communicating.
Yeah, exactly. Yep. That's exactly the point. That's what's important is that you're not in it, you're not related to it, right? What relationship you think you have is a mere translation. If you don't have the option of going into or being into the trees, the forest, whatever you want to call it, that's fine. But that's a limitation, and it's a limitation you can't get around. And this is usually where people get caught up. They say, well, yeah, but in a theoretical world that I'm never going to live in, I could have a relationship with it. And then they speculate from there. And that's where everybody gets into trouble. So, yeah, you can't know what it's like to be in the forest until you're in the forest. There's no way around that. You read all the books you want. You can look at it from a satellite. You can look at it from outside. But you know nothing of being in the forest until you are being in the forest and therefore able to relate
And
to it.
actually,
Can I
I
put
have
something to
to.
the group on this point? Just something that I want to be careful of not departing too far from it, but just to identify what I'm asking about. There's a level of the Gnostic quote unquote move of assuming outer to inner or inner to outer that we could potentially discuss here if that is fruitful. But I'll put it to the group.
Can I first just make a quick aphorism here as a response to Mark? It's that participatory knowledge is intimate. That's the intimacy. So when you are in the forest, you participate, and that's the only way that you can get that knowledge is through the participation.
Right. And exactly on that level, one knowing all about the weather through books or through an oral tradition uh, gives someone some level of access, like the parasocial thing we were discussing. But it's not a replacement for participation, and that is the thing that I was identifying as some of the steps and moves that are made by what's conventionally referred to as Gnosticism. So that's where I saw the connection piece. I don't necessarily want to get into Gnosticism per se. I do want to identify the dynamic being fractaled out there.
Yeah, and I think
But if we could throw the diagram from 60 on, or the trinit the one that has the tripartite on it next to it, just to keep where we're at and maybe move the conversation forward as well.
you mean oh jeez. Clickety clicks. You mean this one? Or you mean the next one?
Yeah,
Because
I think that this is kind of where we're at in the conversation now.
yeah, so I want to. Well, this is actually an amazing thing to highlight the point that I was going to make. Right? So it's like, is is there a participation in not the forest but in the union? Right? And like this is a union, right? So now you're riding on the horse, and now you Fafeki would call this perspectival knowing, right? But you get a new participation, right? Like because you basically use the technology, right, or the service of the horse, the mount, and with that service, your agency changes, and by that, the way that the world lays itself out to you, and the things that are possible as a consequence change. And so it is important, right? Like at this level, even more, right? It's just like I can't explain to you what it's like to be in the forest without you being in the forest. But I can't explain to you what it's like to be in the forest on a horse. Like, because now you have two layers of participation that combine into a third thing, and so you get this complexity, right? Like,
Right, but they
and
don't.
and the more
But hold on.
I don't want to move past the point here, and I'm not saying this in anything other than a genuine sense. But how do you go about relating what you just mentioned about the horse thing is actually kind of pertinent
well,
here
it's like a
Right.
in the
skin.
sense of union? Because, like, and again, this is generally gestured at as logos.
Yeah, but there's a way more important point, right? Which is something that's actually very fundamental to the problem of today, which is you can have one or the other. You can't have them both at the same time. And this is what everybody misses because they say, well, I'm on a horse, so I'm higher up. So my participation in the forest, it encompasses everything of the lower participation. That is false. It does not. It is a different perspective, and it is missing things that aren't in the other perspectives. Now, I realize this isn't sort of universally true in all ways or whatever, but when I'm walking through the woods, that experience is so unique that you cannot get it on a horse, no matter what you do ever, because your relationality is completely different. And that is where the problem comes in, is that people say, well, I have a quote greater relationality, or I have a greater perspective, or you do not. It is different. There is a different set of trade-offs. And so you can't know what the person that's not on the horse has by being on a horse. And that actually is the problem, is people assume that they can, when that can never be true. And it's a huge whopping difference that people sort of aren't accounting for. They're trying to take some kind of superior pole position that's all encompassing, but that isn't available to us as humans, right? And we're just limited creatures, and where we stand matters a lot. But where you stand has a cost, right? There's a set of trade-off, and no matter where you stand, you're missing a bunch of stuff, and you can miss different things or whatever. I get it. You can sort of stitch it together sort of after the fact, but that has its own sets of trade-offs and problems. Like, for example, the world, as it turns out, keeps changing on you much more rapidly than you'd imagine, especially if you use a scientific frame, which is just ironic. So what ends up happening is that people get confused and they think, oh, I can be on the horse and have the best of both worlds. And that's just flat out wrong.
So Mark, if you could tie that to something that is manifesting in our current and by which I mean, the things that are going on around us as we have our conversation world. But also, I don't want to miss when you tie when you well, let's just start with that. Like, could you tie this to something where you see this move being done, and not necessarily go into the consequence of it, but the specific thing that maybe it would be useful to frame it with is, you talked about there's a cost to your stance and position on the landscape. I use language as far as the perspective that impacts as being a dispositional blindness. So is there anywhere in the world around us that you see this kind of dispositional blindness as, and again, different from the Gnostic perspective issue of assuming that the inner and outer align, therefore the outer is manipulable by the inner, or is knowable by the inner, in that sense.
Yeah, so I mean, there are literally hundreds of examples, right? But one good example that is pointed out time and time again is people will say, "Oh, you can't put the autists in this bucket or in this situation. You can't talk about them that way, right?" And then the autists all go, "What are you talking about? You're not autistic. You don't know." Right. So we have a lot of people, and I'll just note they're almost always the exact same people. That might be interesting and important. Speaking on behalf of groups they do not belong to, as though they know something, and then they make ridiculous statements. And there's so many examples. There's the whole thing about Latinx.
If I could just jump
right?
in and point out that this is an active issue in the academic world itself.
Right.
But it's actually directly pertinent here because we're looking at the essentially downstream effects of the naming function.
Right.
They discuss it in the literature as stigma, and who gets to decide the stigma and identity, and that's an entire world that might be fruitful to have this lens once we've kind of gotten our minds and heads around it at the end of these sessions to that issue of identity in that sense. But I just wanted to identify what Mark was saying is is basically obvious and is to the point of it's forcing engagement. So this is something that is very real.
Yeah, and it's choosing the perspective very sneakily, right? You're claiming because what you're doing is you're not saying I'm choosing the perspective instead of this other person. What you're saying is the other person or people or group or institution or whatever has chosen a perspective, and here's a flaw in it. And it's kind of like, okay, but all perspectives have flaws. So like, is this really interesting or important that this particular flaw exists? Right. And then when you try to get rid of that flaw, what other flaw or flaws are you adding? And that's what they don't like. Nobody talks about that. Right. And so you can say it's unfair for you to name this group this way or characterize this group that way because that naming creates a stigma. Well, stigma is just all the things inside the boundary. Right? Like that's what a stigma is, right? And it's like, yes, but what if that's the best description that's available to us despite its flaws? Nobody ever does that math, right? And so that's where you run into the problems. And then if you adopt that without realizing the trick that's been played with you, and I do have a video on navigating patterns about the trick of socialism that outlines this exact trick, because it's bigger than we'll say socialism, but it and it's pertinent to this, right? Because it's pretending as though either there's a perfect perspective and that's available to you, and the person that gave the critique is giving you that perspective, which they can't because they don't have it, right? Or it's just ignoring the fact that perspectives constrain, and you're not, different people understand this differently, right? But a lot of people are just going along, and then what happens is you get something like wokeness that comes along and immediately explodes into absurdity. And the reason why is because it's inherently unbounded, because you took away the boundary, because that boundary in your eyes had a flaw, which you can argue whether or not that was even a flaw, right? But by validating the critique and pretending as though it was a flaw, and maybe it really was a flaw, you've destroyed the boundary, and now you can't understand I don't even know what pronouns are available, right? I don't even know what sexes people could possibly be anymore, because it's just exploded, right? It literally actually combinatorial explosion. And so it's like, well, that's not good. I mean, that's why we need bounding and boundaries and proper naming, right? And when we don't get down to the discussion of, is this proper naming, but we say, no, that naming is bad, right? Then we run into trouble, because the real question is this proper naming? What does proper naming look like? It's a very nuanced, if you want to use that term, discussion. And that's the discussion that we're effectively not having, and being fooled into making judgments that we believe we're not making.
And I want to point out, I watched the video on
If,
Twitter.
if I could just actually point out the citation to what we're discussing, because I just don't. I feel like it's actually really important. I hate to stand on people. I would direct people to things like the article, like self-labeling, perceived stigma toward autism spectrum disorder, and self-esteem and the change in autism nosology by Michael Schaffer, PhD, MSW, and Shay Agramon Donos, MA. I'm happy to find a publicly available version of that document.
Okay. Yeah, we can provide that in the description. So there's this guy basically he was asked whether he could support the actions of Congress on Ukraine, and he went into this whole process about like how basically there was active involvement in shaping public sentiment from like 20 years ago, whatever. And he went through the process, and at the end he said, I cannot support any position that the Congress takes unless this sense-making issue is resolved, right? So he recognized that he was mounted, he was riding a horse that he could not be responsible for, and therefore the perspective that he was receiving from the world was to him, like so corrupted that he wasn't willing to make any judgment from that perspective. And I think that's the right move, right? Like sometimes that like whatever you get fed, right? Like whatever seeds get planted in you, they're corrupted. Like you're not relating to actual heaven. Like you get like the picture that's behind us, right? That's not heaven. That's like a telescope probably zoomed in to like a really 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 small part of heaven, and then it's like, whoa, like, that looks like heaven. Like let's navigate on this map because like this guy made this awesome map for us. And like, no, like you can't navigate on this because it's like a speck in the sky and it doesn't tell you anything about where you're at in the world. Like it just doesn't say anything. And if people start talking to you as if you should navigate by this and you try it, you end up in crazy town. And that's what's happening, right? Like we just get all of these microscopic perspectives and they get extrapolated into the fullness of reality as if that can encompass reality. And like I every time, right, like it doesn't matter who does this, right? Like every time someone makes a system and then starts saying, well, and therefore we need to do this, I'm like, yeah, but what about all the things that don't get captured by the system? Like what about all the things outside that influence the way that the system, even if it's correct, right, is going to react, right? Like that is not accounted for in the system, and then you can even do the perfect thing within the system, but you don't get the result that's necessary.
If if I could just say to that point, one, see the videos that I'm sure exists on navigating patterns on rebellion, and two, uh, which will come back to me in just a moment. Yeah, see the point on rebellion, and I'll come back to my second point when it comes back to me.
Yeah, and just to, you know, I mean, I like what you did there, Manuel. That was pretty good. But when you're in a perspective, when a frame's been given to you and it doesn't serve the function that needs to be done, so, you know, that's the time to reject the frame. Right? And so if somebody says, can you explain using politics, you know, some election, okay? Maybe politics can explain that, but maybe it can't. Like maybe there's no way, right, without breaking the frame, or a lot of people call it exceptions, right? But for, right, if not for this, my prediction within my frame would have worked. Okay, that means your frame's wrong, by the way. It doesn't mean anything else. It means your frame
Okay,
is
that leads perfectly into point number 2 that's come back to me.
Please.
I would direct people's attention to John H. Walton's most recent book in his Lost World series called Lost World of the Prophets, where, as we've discussed, looking at rebellion, Walton tracks through the Genesis pattern in an earlier book, and then he looks at what it is to be a prophet, and essentially posits that the different prophets in the canon have different positional relationships and are addressing different positional things. To borrow from a Verbachian lexicon, the prophets themselves translate around the transjective space. Sometimes they address the king, then they'll start to address the people, which is where you ultimately start to make the move of, and this is where I connected this to Manuel's middle comment of his most recent comment, which is that when someone believes they have the total pattern that comes directly from the world of from the above, and then they want to correct things or bring things back into alignment, there is resistance. Sometimes there is force. But the thing here is that the prophet is the person who can understand the delineations of, okay, I don't have the perfect perspective, but I do have enough of a perspective to be able to try to align things at the microcosm level that are within my personal reach. And that's a crucial point. And thank you for allowing me the space to share that.
Anyway, wanna try going through 18? Then we mirror what happened last week, which is like, but I bet we didn't have these discussions around that last week. Yeah. So example, right? So he's setting frame, which we talked about a bunch. So now he's exemplifying the frame. He's using the idea or the appearance of 3 angels in front of Abraham. So it's interesting that Abraham gets contrasted with Sarah, where there's a masculine and a feminine within the human domain, right? Kind of like Adam and Eve.
Can I also just point from the narrative itself that Abraham and Sarah undergo a name change, and since we've understood names in a certain way, that can contextualize certain pieces. But please go on.
Yeah, so it's interesting that they have a Yud, while Abraham doesn't have a child, if I'm correct. So the Yud is substituting for his child, and he's instructing him, right? So now you get not only naming the animals, but also naming that which is in your dominion. And it's interesting that Sarah, in some sense, is hidden in the tent, And then the proposition of the Lord is, I will return in a year and you will have a son. So there's been this interaction, this exchange, right? Like, and it gets explained as the planting of the seed, and then reproduction happens.
Right, but I wanna just stop briefly because I don't know why John didn't point this out. Uh, the woman Sarah is in the tent, right? And so what that represents is the hidden matriarchy, right? The divine feminine that is in its proper place and also not out in front where the danger is, right? Like, look, strangers appear from the distance. That's how it works. Like, that's how the world comes at us phenomenologically. And maybe you want to keep the precious things hidden from those strangers in case you need to fight them and defeat them, right? In case they're hostile. In this case, they're not. That's a plus. But again, we get confused with the specific case and the general case. Generally, you want to protect the divine feminine as best you can because it's precious and it's in some sense not replaceable. Unfortunately, men are pretty sadly replaceable. We just suck. It's just the way it is. So that symbolism is clearly in here, and it's important, right? Because that relationship comes up in the diagram in this chapter. So I just wanted to mention that. Also shout out to John's wonderful book title.
Good catch, Mark. You're right. That plays directly into the hidden matriarchy. I can add here that the center corresponds to like that which is also hidden, like the soft inner bowels, and it's protected by an outer layer, by a skeleton, by a skin, etc. And what that represents is the same idea as with Sarah. It's precious, but it's also vulnerable, meaning that even though the center, what we have in the center is there's a lot, normalcy is what dominates in society because there's so much of it, but it's very, very fragile. It doesn't take, in a society based on trust, which is a network of intimate relations in one sense. So it's an intimacy relation network. It doesn't take many bad apples to ruin that from within. So if you bring in something into the center, into the tent, if you like, to use in Sarah's tent, that then she doesn't have what it takes to defend herself. That's why the tent is there. That's why we need to protect the center. That's why the divine feminine resides in the center. All right.
So I don't really know what this relates to, but there's a portion of the Bible called the Hall of Faith, and I know Sarah is in there. I think she might be the only woman, and she's in there partially because there were some people out to kill Abraham, and Abraham ordered Sarah to lie and basically say, "I'm your sister, not my wife." So that's I don't know where that lies. RJ mentioned the function of a prophet is one who doesn't have perfect perspective, but one that aligns things within the microcosm that they can see. And then we've shown some diagrams that have some like dark on like the angel and the animal diagram we shown. It's got parts of inversion in there. But I just wanted to bring that up as part of the narrative. I don't know how to slot it into this framework.
Yeah, I'm wondering, Danny, why that's a problem, right? Because I mean, one thing that I see a lot is people are like, truth is the only thing that matters. It's the most important thing, and et cetera, et cetera. But that's goodness is the most important thing, not truth. And sometimes you have to sacrifice truth for goodness. And so I'm like, I don't see a conflict there whatsoever. But so I'm wondering why that's a concern for you.
I think the word to key in on here is inversion, especially in communication. There is a inversion
and that's why I like the word. I sometimes will use the word juxtapose or versus between giving and receiving. So that is also part. I don't know how to have great words around this. The fact that there's an inversion itself is linked to gestures at, in a way, the framing that can only express as two sides of the same coin. But when you are handing something to someone, they must receive it. When you breathe in, you must then, there's the inversion at both sides of the breathing process to breathe out. Hopefully that is contextually helpful.
No, it isn't that there's a conflict, but Protestant pulpits will preach that this is like, oh, how amazing it is that Sarah is in the Hall of Faith by following, by being given an order from her husband to lie, and saying like that. That's how important submission is, right? And so they'll kind of say that that's the meaning. And I just don't know about that, if that's right. And the same thing with like bread, for example. So, well, like in here, bread is like an idiom for pride. It puffs up and it's full of nothing, which is why in the Exodus when they're they got to get all the bread out of the house, and it's symbolic of a purification. I don't know if that jives. That's kind of what I've heard from like Protestant pulpits. I don't know if that jives with Matthieu Pageau's framework here.
Well, I would just caution around trying to introduce or take on or stand from the position in the landscape of any given particular sect. The thing about being a sect in it of itself is kind of admitting that there's a microcosm that disagrees with a different microcosm. So, in as much as the what we're looking at here at Abraham is moving forward from the Genesis pattern, and kind of when you square a number, you can maybe think of that as folding a paper onto itself. So just trying to interpolate from the end point is just not good math. Is the best. I don't mean to be rude or to offend any sensibilities, and I'm also thinking of being mindful about sensibilities of the potential audience.
I have a comment on this, the bread. In the bread, the way that it's being used in this, like the Protestant sect or whatever, is not as a symbol but as a metaphor. And Pageau makes a point that symbols are not metaphors; they are different. So it's as a metaphor. He's talking about the bread as like a metaphor for pride. That's perfectly fine, because metaphors are ad hoc, they're pragmatic, they're in the moment, they're disconnected. You can just use anything for anything, almost like an ape that finds a stick which it uses as a tool to eat ants and then throws it away. That's what metaphors are like. But whereas symbols are more like capital, like a tool that you have made and that you keep. So for Pageau, in order for something to count as a symbol, it's not enough to find one association. You must find a repeated pattern at different scales, preferably at all various different scales of fractality. And if you can find that pattern on all scales and multiple instances of it that connects with all the other elements that you have found that also fit into that pattern, then you can talk about it as a symbol. So symbolism is, well, I hesitate to use the word science here, but it's an art. It's like, it's not just a hodgepodge, ad hoc, pragmatic metaphor in the moment, which using bread in that sense of as a metaphor for pride sounded like. So what Pageau is doing is very, very different. It's not compatible at all.
Yeah, it's richer, but I want to go back to the thing about, the example that Sarah has to listen to Abraham because Abraham knows something that she doesn't. Can understand why that would be confusing, right? Not that it's not accurate and true the way you presented it, Danny. But also, it goes the other way too. And this is what people miss. That is not a story about women having to submit to men. That's actually not what it's about, right? It's more along the lines of what RJ was talking about, which when you have a prophet, the reason why you listen to the prophet is because he has a perspective that you do not have and cannot have. So it's about submission. And if the submission is only one way, then you've gotten the whole world wrong, for real. Like, no, right? And that's why the postmodern top-down power from above narrative doesn't work, right? And I think this is probably a side effect of not having a veneration for the divine feminine as such, right? So the Catholics have Mary or Theotokos, or whatever you want to call her, right? And because of that, you know, if you go to an Orthodox service, they just, I mean, I think they say wisdom 3 times and they say Theotokos the rest of the service. It's unbelievable, right? So that's clearly at the center of attention in some sense, right? And when you don't have that, you can't properly contextualize stories like that because you think that they're about male and female. It's not. It's about submission to an authority, and that authority has authority because of something else. In this case,
Can I step in here?
Sure.
I'd like to propose some alternative language that hopefully captures the same thing, although there is certainly value in everything that was stated around submission and authority. Going back to Abraham, perhaps if we look at this in the sense of the landscape and the different position that Abraham is relaying, and the different, as opposed to the different positions of Sarah, etc. And we're looking at the moment of when Abraham directs Sarah to do something with her identity such that protection is engendered for the both of them. I don't see that necessarily as only as submission. The word choice I'd like to offer here is recognition of the landscape and admonition of the appropriate function towards fruitfulness, towards the protection. And while that can be expressed in the lexicon of authority, in the moment in which we are discussing it and our language is contextualized by whatever post-meta modern, you know, it is today's date, it's today's year, which is somewhere in 2024, right? Which I'm just recognizing how these words are different in the way that they're different right now. So again, instead of submission, recognition and admonition of the landscape towards functionality, not necessarily teleologically so, but certainly pragmatically so towards protection.
Yeah, that's a good point, RJ. And I think that's part of the problem. I can't protect you if you reject the protection, right? I can't save you from the dragon if you don't believe there are dragons, right? Because you'll see everything I do as an imposition.
And the other side again, right? The imposition of nurturing. From if we could just tie this in a way, assuming people have seen the video on nurturing. Please go on if you could point at it essentially coming from the feminine side in John's lexicon.
Yeah, and again, I think that the sort of the problem comes up with, you take one story that shows one side, the male perspective, and you ignore the other stories that show the female side of the exact same thing. And I think what John was pointing out in particular is important, right? Like, symbolism is deep. It's not shallow. Metaphors are shallow. Metaphors are useful. I use metaphors all the time. They're great, but they're not sufficient, right? They're necessary, but not sufficient. And
I also like to point out that you can drown in deep things if you're not careful.
Right. Well, and you need the skills to swim there. If you're going to, maybe again, you just need to take it from an authority instead, because it's a lot easier, right? Than trying to figure things out yourself.
And the Petersonian sense of authority. The Petersonian sense of authority.
Right. but that's the thing, right? If somebody else has already done the work, why do you also want to do that work if it's already done, right? Like, what are you doing to yourself? What are you doing to the world?
There is utility in understanding how the wheel works without necessarily having to reinvent the wheel, but knowing how to build the wheel is also, and tech. I don't like this framing, but hierarchically more important.
Can be, isn't always,
Can be,
won't
yes.
be for most people, right? Like,
Thank you.
most
Yes,
people
that's
can't build
that's a
that
crucial
wheel.
correction. Thank you.
Right. And most people can't build the wheel. And so them wasting their time trying to do something they can't do is actually not good. And yeah, my nurture versus protection stream on navigating patterns is important to this, because on the female side, if you cut your hand with your chainsaw, this is all hypothetical, of course. I would never cut my hand with a chainsaw like an idiot. And you don't allow somebody to help you, right? You're rejecting the nurture, right? And
you're very likely to bleed out too.
You're like,
and,
yeah,
and
exactly.
to the point about borders and keeping, I just want to make that salient to the metaphor. Please continue.
Right. Yeah. You're when you reject the nurture, you can die, right? And you have a perspective of, I hurt myself with my chainsaw, I have to go take care of this, right? But then whatever you think taking care of it is might be wrong, because your perspective's a little bit like, I feel stupid, I shouldn't have done that, and it'll be fine, it doesn't need stitches or anything like that. But you might be wrong about that. Like, it might need stitches, and if you don't get stitches, it might be a problem. I didn't need stitches, but and I happen to have known that. But on
the point of stitches, there's a cooperation there, and there's a cooperation with Abraham and Sarah that if you're only looking through the lens of authority, it's obscured dispositionally.
No, that's a good point. Right. So the key is to recognize, we'll say, the feminine authority and the masculine authority and how they relate, right? And not to reject the relation on the grounds of tyranny, or on the grounds of top-down power from above, or on the grounds of, authority is bad, or, whatever ridiculous grounds you have, because there's always a hierarchy, because people aren't equal. That's not a state that can ever happen. Thank goodness, because that would be boring and would all be one thing. That would suck. But therefore, there's a hierarchy, and that hierarchy changes based on what's happening in the world. So it's not like, oh, men are always at the top of the hierarchy. That's not that. Men are at the top of certain hierarchies for sure. None of them exclusively, by the way. Like, there were female pharaohs. I don't know what to tell you. Learn some history, right? When you reject the relation, or when you fail to understand the depth of the possible relations, you can't cooperate anymore. And now you're going to be alone, right? And you're going to try to insist that, people should be a certain way, or do a certain thing, or not do a certain thing, or, whatever it is, or you'll try to act out in the world as though things are a certain way. Like, I'm the head of the household, I'm always in charge of, everything.
So
and that
can
won't
we look at this as how this impacts the naming of the relationship switch from wife to sister, as far as we're looking at that particular section of the narrative? But I don't even really want to look at that so much as it points to and allows me to gesture at the issue around naming itself. Because once you've named something, you are kind of placing some loose borders as to what can and can't come in, and what things aren't. And there's a tension between the authority versus the recognition of competency when we're looking at that here.
Yeah, naming is the thing that points the attention at the potential relationship, right?
Can we take a second? What was the justification given for naming? Because it had to do with threats, right? Like, why is being a sister better than being a wife? Because I'm like completely lost on that part.
Well, it's not that it's better; it's that if he is not a brother, then he is exposed to danger. It has to do with cultural context at the time, which is just where getting too deep in the specific context presents difficulties like this. But essentially, if he's not
Sarah's brother, he will be killed, such that Sarah can be taken by another man.
Right.
And also, as his
he's-
brother, as the brother, he is the only male representative and has certain rights around marriage and would be given certain things in return for marriage. As the story goes on, that is what that does happen.
It was an act of cowardice
It's
on
not
Abraham's
just brother;
part.
it's kind of like brother-father.
It was an act of cowardice, and he was later punished for it.
Yeah, but it is like the thing that I want to see is like, so he's placing himself in a position of authority over her that he doesn't have as a husband, because that's basically what I get out of it.
No, he was protecting himself. He was for his own motivations. He was told to stand for something, and he didn't stand for it. I don't remember the details in the story, but he definitely ordered her to do it out of fear. That's that I'm certain about.
Right, and that's where getting too far into the specific context makes it difficult for the fact that we're looking at the diagram. So maybe we could just pull back to the diagram and
Well,
I don't want to close the door on comments and things. So let's please
no,
get
but I had a reason, right? So because the way I look at Genesis is that they go into, well, I guess this archetypal relationship, right? And they show the pattern in different manners, different layers, right? So it's in relation to the animals, then it's in relation to within the family, right? And then they also go into misapplications of the pattern, right? So they highlight how things go if they go wrong, right? So you first have it with Cain and Abel, right? And then you get different layers, right? So it's not a perfection, right? Like it's actually maybe an unfolding in some sense, right? Like it's and it's also sequential, right? So it okay, in the sequence there's a lesson to be learned, right? Because I also think that it has something to do with growing up and things that you run into existentially and then have to overcome, and then you run into the counter reaction, right? Like the opposite side of the coin effectively, right? Like the blowback, and you have to resolve that, right? And then these things happen on different layers as well, right? So we need to have to get the sensitivity of these layers, and then through these layers we can get a recognition of the true pattern, right? And then if we go to this idea of a metaphor versus a symbol, right? Like the symbol is basically from heaven, right? Like it's that which comes at us from heaven and that we can connect to from different perspectives. While when we make a metaphor, we look up from ourselves and say, that's like that, right? Like that we make it from our perspective, and we make it in our image in some sense, or from our image. Maybe that's better. Because we will it to our purpose, right? Like we're like, okay, like that shape you can put there as well, and then it reveals something, right? While I don't think symbols are merely revealing things. They're
No,
like
they're not.
by which things get revealed or something, which is
Well, I mean, no, symbols are more significant than that, Manuel. I mean, the symbol has this multi-connectedness, this many-to-many relationship that a metaphor doesn't. So metaphor is looking across with the only option of a linear connection. And so, for example, if you take an individual story, any individual story, it really in any book, but we'll just use the Bible because that's what we're talking about, right? You take any individual story in the Bible, and you can, if you look at it horizontally across and you make a linear set of relationships, you can come to a certain set of conclusions, right? But again, those are limited conclusions, right? Because any story is a metaphor for your personal experience, right? Or your personal experience is a metaphor for that story, depending upon which perspective you want to take. Not that I recommend the latter, obviously, but you can look at it that way. People do. that might be bad for them, but whatever, that happens. A symbol is the thing that allows you to connect, we'll say, similar stories together so that you can understand that, especially in the case of the Bible, the stories are designed to show you the same situation in different contexts, but also the same situation in the same context, right? With different actions, where maybe lying about your relationship to somebody is cowardice in a certain instant, right? And the fact that that the fact that that happens, right, is a show of, we'll say, relationship, right, in a certain way. Now, that relationship isn't always wrong. And so taking a single story and going, aha, the lesson in this story is that's wrong, right? You can't throw out the fact that the authority was given to name, and the name was changed to change the relationship, right? Because other stories are going to show differently, right? They're going to show where, oh, had you not made that switch, that renaming, things would have gone very, very badly, and then you're rewarded for it, right? And so that's the difference between symbolism and metaphor. In metaphor, you're just looking across. You don't have the option to move up and down and see the multi-connectedness to the other stories, which is what's really important, right? Because each individual story is not telling a coherent set of lessons that make sense outside of the other stories. That's why the Bible's the most connected book, right? Peterson talks about that.
Mark, can you also cover aphorism and then idiom?
Probably not.
Okay, well, something that might need a video or something to return to,
Yeah.
because I think that's actually very, very valuable for people to think about.
Yeah, that gets into more of the abstraction that I think you're pointing back to, and it's like,
Well, we'll get there in the book as we go along.
That's what I thought. Yeah. I think that's better. But I did want to note in this, like, if you look really closely, or hopefully you didn't have to look too closely, Abraham is in the middle and mediating on behalf of everybody. That's actually really important to note, right? There's a reason for that. And again, this goes back to the proper relationship to the world, like, and to protection, right, versus nurture, right? And there's nurturing going on the top and on the bottom of this particular, because this is another weird z-axis plus y-axis, I think, if I remember correctly, a diagram, right? So it's combining two different two-dimensional perspectives in a way. But if you can envision it in terms of nurture and protection, I think it's a little bit easier to understand why Abraham is in the center, protecting the youth and Sarah against, because you can't think of it as angels, because really just something appears, right? In the beginning, when things appear, you don't know if they're
well. So the thing is, angels is a little bit disruptive, but if you think of them as, one might be able to translate the language as messengers and representatives in their own right, then that might help people be able to relate.
And messengers bring information, right? So it's just a change, right? Like they bring us of change. And I think so to make bread, right? Like it goes into it, right? Like it's the feminine, right? Because it's the capturing of, right? So there's a receptive component in there where the multiplicity gets unified in response, right? And the youth is an active, like he's picking out, right? Well, Abraham is picking out. That's the thing that I also wanted to say for the youth, right? So he's taking authority not over what he's doing, but what he's doing it to, like, and then you get the cutting as well, right? Which is again a selection, right? Because it's not the whole animal. Like you take and then you prepare it, right? So and
Yeah.
it's using a knife which is sharp, like it's division again.
Yeah, and I cover the knife thing and cutting in detail in my book, because cutting is essentially like masculine, cutting a distinction, like the all cutter, the all knower, the omniscient being, cutting into the void, into the all potential. It comes from Indo-European mythology. This notion that Manu, the proto-being, cut his twin Yimo into many pieces that becomes the like the sky and the earth and so forth, makes the world from the pieces of Yimo, the twin. And you can see the relationship to Genesis there. Now, it's also interesting to see that you find this ancient story of cutting some person into many pieces in an inversion story in Egyptian mythology with Set that kills Osiris, his brother. And so Set is the evil twin of Osiris. And Set tries to take on the role of the creator. So a creator cuts into the void to create existence, cuts into chaos to create that which exists, order. But Set doesn't have that power. He tries to imitate that, and so he inverts the role. So instead of cutting into chaos to produce order, he cuts into order to put it back into chaos. So he cuts something that's already ordered and brings it back into chaos. That is basically like the satanic inversion of creation.
Also, accidentally, which is really important. Like, he doesn't think that's what he's doing.
No, of course, yeah, of course. But like,
wait. To that exact point about how it is accidental, that which cuts masculine can also be that which levers feminine in John's lexicon. I'm in no way saying that gender or and etc. impacts my worldview or how people should or shouldn't behave. I'm identifying that, again, that which cuts in a different physical translation shift is also a lever.
How so? What do you mean by lever?
I mean, you can literally, in a sense of, let me make it concrete and actual. You can take a knife and you can lever a rock out of a cleft.
Okay, I have to think about that, because when I look into the symbolic things, I'm not just looking at associations. Like, I'm not just looking at one specific thing. There has to be a pattern of repeating. So that this can be true, but I need to think about it. So I cannot make a comment on it.
Well, it goes to what Mark was saying about the accidental shift, because in the same way as starting to use noticing that a knife can also lever things, and that it has more than one aphoristic utility, can cause someone to think that the knife has total utility in all situations. Or it can, if that's not noticed, it can cause someone to try to apply the knife to all situations. And the fact that it's in some cases an accident, because is also tied to what I refer to as dispositional stance engendering certain restrictions. So if you are and physically have 2 feet on the ground, you definitionally are not kicking. In that sense, the knife, in a context of how it's wielded, has multimodality, and that's reflected in moving from the y-axis, the cutting, to the z-axis, the noting that you can also lever, which is the levering is the x-axis. And the x-axis is represented by having 2 things next to each other on the diagram here and on page 60.
Okay, I need to think about that. But what I can say is that cutting is directly related to knowledge, which is what we also been talking about. and it also relates to sex. All these words have the original same root in Indo-European language. The Indo-European root for cutting is sek, which gives rise to both the word sex and to scientia, science, and conscience. So consciousness, science, and like knowledge and sex are all the same word, come from cutting. So when we say that,
Can I also just point out that in the narrative from which these diagrams are abstracting from, to know and to have sexual contact,
yes, I was
are
just going to make,
euphemistically switched
no,
very
it's not
often.
it's not just
And my
euphemistic.
point,
It's
right?
not
But
just euphemistic. Like he knew her.
again, I'm actually using that to gesture at something, and then I'd love to hear you out for a while.
Okay.
I really would. I want to point to a book that I'll bring up, so I don't spend too much time. But it essentially talks about how the more than euphemistic switch there is also applied to what Paul van der Kleijs refers to as God number two, the very pattern itself, and the thing about having that euphemistic switch has consequences. But I would like to hear you out and continue, please. Specifically, again, just the embodiment of to know is then translated in a way that you can take a knife out of one context. You can take the way that you're using to know as sex or intercourse specifically from one context, interpersonal, to the God number two, personalizes or actually personifies in the Hellenistic sense the interaction and communicational mode to God number two. And there's a great book about how that actually is not unique to any particular culture, which is to say, this is not something that is going on in the text. This is a function of, this may be a function of how, I guess, relational ontology works. So I apologize for stepping in so much recently.
So what I can say is that this is a very ancient symbol for sex. So in Islam, like Muhammad tells his followers to plow the fields when he referring to have sex as often as possible with his wife. She shall be as such a field unto you that you plow. So the plow is a cutting device that cuts into the feminine earth to sow your seed, right? And this comes from the same Semitic source as knowing. He knew her, so it's knowledge. Sowing the seed, that's heaven, like Pageau talks about heaven coming down, is the same thing as the seed. It's symbolically the same thing, which is bringing knowledge or creating knowledge by bringing meaning and order into the world, which is the seed, right? So knowledge, cutting, and consciousness are all this, like symbolically related, which is the reason why the press has debunked the notion that Joe Biden has dementia by saying that in private he has a sharp mind. He has a sharp mind, as opposed to having a dull mind, which would be like a meaning that he is either cognitively impaired or not very smart. So sharp implies a cutting device. So again, that means consciousness is like a knife, and that can cut things. And we segment things. When we categorize things, we segregate. The word segregate or segment comes from sec, also cutting. A section, when we make things into categories, we discriminate. Separating one thing from another is all the masculine act of cutting, which we do with our mind when we make categories. Now, if you combine cutting, discrimination into different parts, we discriminate one thing from another by cutting them apart, with above and below, you get hierarchy. So hierarchy is a combination of above and belowness and the separation. And if you worship heaven only, which is idealism, that is the worship of heaven alone, then being above is the only thing that is valuable, and therefore it's oppressive with the hierarchy. So they try to make things equitable, remove the distinction between above and below by removing discrimination in the world. But that is like an idolization of heaven. But if you look at the relationship between a mother and a child, that is also a very prototypical hierarchy where the mother is above and the child is below. And the child is weak, in fact, taking on a feminine role and is being nurtured by the mother from above. And if you think in this term that hierarchy is evil, then the mother here is an awful human being for being in this relationship with her child. But we understand that this is a good thing, like this is a good relation. So hierarchy isn't necessarily evil, can be, but like in and of itself, it's just the way that the world patterns itself. Okay, I've been talking a lot, so I just wanted to bring that out.
The book I'm referring to is called God and an Anatomy by Francesca Stavrakopoulou.
Yeah. Do we want to cover? Do we want to just cover the nurturing that's going on in here, Manuel? Because I think it's important, right? Like Sarah nurtures the flower into cakes, right? And then Mature says it's important that they're not eaten. I don't know what to make of that. But the nurturing aspect is here, right? So you see the contrast between protect and nurture right in this, in this outline. And again, that's why Abraham, from this view, which is not the only view, right, but it's the view we have right now, is in the center, right? And he's playing the role of protector in that. And everything below is nurturing that which is higher, which are the angels. And I think, seeing it in terms of nurture and protect, and again, I got the live stream, so if you need details, you can go there, is really important, right? Because as with all of these images, I think the images can make a lot more connections than what is apparent, we'll say, in the moment.
So yeah, I maybe want to do a different framing because Abraham is the mediation, but he's also the skin, right? And so like the skin does shield, right? Like you're saying, like it is a boundary, and a translatory quality as well, right? So yeah, and there's where's it's the he's being an interface, right? Because he's talking. I think he's presenting the food as well or something. And but the nurturing also happens, right? Like the creation of the food, right? Like the generative aspect happens outside of him, right? Like he's not partaking in that that thing. So I guess that's interesting to see that role, right? And how, yeah, there's a, I don't know, like I guess there's an appropriate place for things to be. That's maybe uh, the last lesson there. And I'm not really sure where you want to place the cutting here, right? Because like the way that I think is like the angels, they do they come with a request?
Okay, so the only way it relates is to the animals, like animal sacrifice and to preparing of the animal for preparing the flesh. That's in this relationship, that's where that enters. So that it's the preparation for nurturing.
So, but the way I see the flesh here is the proper sacrifice presented to the outside, right? So like, is that where the discernment is appropriate? And before that, what is, it's like, in some sense, like the Sarah is creating the womb that holds the message or something, right? Or the invitation of the angels by which it can be transformed or into the proper flesh. Like,
Well, no, I mean, he's kind of explicit about this, right? He says making bread from flour is a process of materialization, right? And then Manuel, I think you and I settled on manifestation as our term for that. So if you're buzzing around navigating patterns, manifestation, or any of our discussions, really, we use manifestation quite a lot. That's the same as materialization in some sense. It's used almost interchangeable, I'd say. And then whereas preparing meat from an animal is the process of refinement, right? And so manifestation or materialization is the same as nurturing, right? Like you're taking these components and turning them into something greater than they were. Whereas refinement is the cutting away of, we'll say, the parts that aren't edible, right? So that you have what's left of the parts that are edible, right? And then that is all related to this idea that he talks about a little later on, right? The flesh of the animal must be cooked to become the body of these heavenly messengers, right? So, and that's we'll say a further refinement, right? But this whole act in both cases is
well, no,
bringing
I think it was the bread that needs to be cooked to be the body. Like, that's
flesh of the animal must therefore be, which then be cooked to become the body of the heavenly messengers. The messengers don't eat the bread, right? And then after that, he talks about the bread is the process of vulgarization, right? It means that something too fine flour has been materialized in something more tangible, right? And it's not eaten, right? But then you're also bringing down, or sorry, you're raising up the animal, the lower, up to the higher, right? You're giving the animal up. Giving up is what everybody misses in this sacrifice discussion, among other things. You're giving it up, and that's part of how you meet heaven and earth, right? It's giving up the animal, right? And the ordering matters, right? Because you could say, well, you reap the crop to get the flour, right? And then you build it back up into something else, right? And then you're also, cutting the animal for refinement, right? But order matters, right? Sequence matters. And that's where people get messed up. They don't like the asymmetry and the fact that the sequence actually helps to determine the valence or the direction, right? Or is an important knowledge component to understanding the world. Like it matters if you say, I'm going to stab you, and then you stab person, or if you stab them and then say, I'm going to stab you. Those are two different things, right? The same end result is there, right? But there's two different valences just based on sequence. Nothing else changed, just the sequence, the order of operations. But like, that's really important because it determines the difference between the bread and the animal sacrifice, and why one was eaten and the other one wasn't. Like the sequence plays into, it's not the only thing that determines it, but it plays into that determination, and we often kind of miss that piece. So I just wanted to highlight all that, and hopefully we'll get to the end of this. Who knows?
Yeah. So I like. Okay. Yeah. Like. So there's. Yeah. I'm still struggling, right? So there's the hosting of the angels, which is. Yeah. Like. I'm still struggling with that because he's making the analogy basically with the hosting of the spirit within the body.
Yeah, it's the same.
And
right, there's a middle ground, right? This is we can fight about this on the Discord server afterwards. There's a neutral space, all right, and that space has to get inhabited by something, right? And it matters what, which is why you need a mediator. The mediator figures out, is this a good thing to have inhabiting our space or not, right? And then if it's good, then it needs to be sustained or fed, right? And therefore you need the sacrifices to make that happen. I think that's the easiest way to think about it. I don't know if that answered your question or not, but
No, I think I need to reframe it a little bit, because if you keep it in the food metaphor, I think it gets confusing, right? So if you do it as in building a house, right? Like the one thing is to get all the materials, right? You just have all the building blocks, right? Which is the making bread. And then you organize the building blocks into the form of a house, which now enables living. That's the offering back up, right? So now you create the space that can be inhabited by the angels, or by housing.
right. But Manuel, the problem with looking at it that way, none of what you said is wrong at all, right? Like 0% incorrect. That's a horizontal way of looking at this. And this diagram is along the Z, I think it's the Z and Y axis. I'm bad at math, but it's along two different axes at once. So it's not horizontal at all. And that, I think, is where people got wrapped up with the book again, because I'm not saying it's easy and that anybody can do it. That's not the case at all. That's why we have book clubs.
But you could argue that the materials are two-dimensional, right? And then when you make a house, you have a three-dimensional.
Yeah, you can, but then you lose vertical causality, and now the relationships are actually all squished. And that's why you have a problem understanding it, right? Because you squished the relationships. You can't do that. You have to re-enchant it or enchant it, right? Back up so that you can understand it's not one. You're not changing one thing here and having one change here. You're changing one thing here and three things down below. Like, that's where everybody gets wrapped up, because we're used to these linear one-to-one relationships. And this isn't second order effects. This is the middle ground between first and second order effects, where a single first order effect having a single first order effect, having a single effect, is a linear relationship. But a single first order effect having four effects in hopefully multi-dimensional space is a non-linear relationship. And that's where people get confused.
Right. So this connects to the video on cognitive overload from yesterday.
Also true. Yeah. See my live stream on navigating patterns from last night. Yeah. And this is, it really is all about how many dimensions, right, or how many free variables you understand the world in. And the problem of what I call the age of gnosis, if you follow my Twitter, is that we scientize everything. We cut it all up, right? To go back to what John was saying, we cut it up. That's what science means. It means to cut up using our consciousness, which also means to kind of cut up, by the way. Are you seeing a pattern yet? Right. And then, right, we are told we can do that, and that gives us an understanding of the world, and that's wrong. That's just incorrect. What it does is it gives you an understanding of a very small part of the world, and that understanding is in all cases irrelevant, right? Because without a context, a telos, if you will, make final cause great again, without a final cause, the fact that you divided something up and cut relationships can't be related to anymore. Like, once you cut it up, you kill it, right? It's dead.
I also need to point out that there's a similar move that goes on in what's, again, conventionally referred to as Gnosticism, that is specifically a scaling issue. Because not only are they trying to, not only is it that axiomatic setup assumes that the inner reflects the outer one-to-one, and that's the connecting piece.
Right. So the move to get out of this, or to improve upon this problem, is to realize that it's not a one-to-one relationship. It's a one-to-many relationship. And again, I'm not even getting into second order effects, which is worse. Like, that's when things get really interesting. And I'm not remembering the whole book quite in my head at the moment, but I'm not even sure he gets into that, right? Because those are all implications from, well, first order effects always have second order effects, but they're all implications from movement.
And I think he does not get into certain aspects of this, strategically so. Linking back to the triggering of translation and jargon into intent versus practicum being resolved by mediation, but the challenge of the mediator to the system can trigger the vanguardism of a misapplied Moses pattern.
Yeah,
and that's also in part confused for eschatological return of the Messiah.
right. Well, but I think I want to make a more general case on that, RJ, which is to say, like everything you said was bang on, which is to say the problem with trying to deal with second order effects ever is that you always stray into the occult. You always stray into Gnosticism. You always, like, even just trying to understand second order effects is a mistake. It's a complete error. It's not something that is able to be rationalized or consciously understood by a mere human being, because they are all definitionally.
I do want to play devil's advocate and say the attempt and recognizing that it's not doable is itself a fruit of certain aspects of this. So it's not to say that because it's not doable, don't think about it. It's important to think about how it's not doable.
So I just wanted to comment on what you were saying, Mark, because it's very nice that you were talking about this cutting is also what you do to kill, because I'm literally writing about that exactly in my book. Because in science, when you cut things apart, you're at the same time killing whatever. If there's something alive, that you're wounding it, and at the very minimum, and possibly killing that thing. Like the worst case is that you kill it. So that is deconstruction, right? If you have something that is put well together and you start trying to find out how it's put together by deconstructing it, in the process, you lose meaning. So hence the meaning crisis comes from cutting things apart. Now, what Matthieu Pageau points out is then you can cut flesh, but you have to then put it into its appropriate place. In this case, a proper offering, right? Offering of the flesh, like that corresponds to, like, whenever you do the cutting, make sure that whatever you end up with, the parts, the segments, must then be used and applied or put together again into some kind of wholesome thing. Otherwise, you will lose unity, you will lose meaning. So cutting gone astray is essentially like materialism, where everything is cut apart, which is killing the world.
That's well said, John. Yeah, and the way to avoid arbitrary cutting is to make sure you have a purpose in mind, and also to consult with people outside of yourself to make sure that you actually are qualified to cut, because that takes a certain set of skills, right? And also know what you're doing, right? Because in a lot of cases, if you haven't done it before, just thinking about how the world is put together, you can run into trouble. This is where Gnosticism comes from. It's trying to understand something that's too big for you, and you just make bad associations. You have to know that bad associations are an option and avoid them, right? Otherwise, you'll get cognitively overloaded and do bad things, even though that wasn't what you expected to happen. And that's part of the problem. Is a lot of times we make predictions and expectations that are inappropriate for us to try to make, and then we misapprehend the world, and then we get angry and resentful because our predictions are wrong, and that makes us unsafe. We're unprotected when we're overloaded, right? Or when we misapprehend the world for any other reason. We have a bad model of the world or whatever. Yeah, that's a big problem, and it is all to do with, well, you got a knife, but do you have the skill to use it?
Yes, and I would just like to add a couple of points. I'll try to be very brief here. One thing is that if you listen, if we have talked about the opposite or the complementary dual of nurture to be protection. Whereas if you listen to the typical debate in society, nurture is placed in as an opposite to nature, the nurture versus nature. Interestingly, both of those are feminine. So that is like materialism in its essence. Like you've removed the masculinity completely. You're only having nurture and nature too, and remove protection. You remove hierarchy, discrimination, all of these things that belong also there in that system. So that's one thing. The other thing relating to consumption. Now, we are talking about eating bread, which is a form of consumption, and consumption is like, if we're going to relate this a little bit to what Vervaeke likes to talk about, eros, philia, and agape. Eros is consumption, whereas philia is relation, and agape is being consumed. So eros is love from below, whereas agape is love from above. And agape is therefore is nurture. So when the mother feeds her child, nurtures her child, that's an agape eros relation, where the child is in a pure consumption mode, whereas the mother is being consumed by the child. Agape, the eros relation. So the being below is feminine. So the eating, the consumption is feminine in this order, and being consumed, which is then sacrifice, is love from above, which is the masculine variant of that. Ironically, now the mother stands in a masculine relationship to her child, which is interesting. So nurture is the masculine version of nature. It's so both of them are feminine, but nurture has been raised up above nature as a more masculinized version of nature. Okay, I tried to be brief.
Yeah, that was great. I really like that. I just wanted to share one thing because to me it's a mnemonic device that's easy to stay in my consciousness. Father Eric said curiosity is a sin when we were in Arkansas. He made a statement that said, "I have no business reading an anatomy textbook." Emmanuel 2 weeks ago mentioned how 2 + 2 = evil, but I think it's important to keep that in mind. But what we discussed briefly here is that you're not going to have a perfect map of the microcosm, but it's important to have a purpose, especially if you're going to do practices that are alone, like praying, meditating, or introspecting, which are 3 distinct processes. It's important to know why you're doing it. Otherwise, they may not work, or they could corrupt you even. But yeah, I remember when he said curiosity is a sin. I that stuck with me. It was easy to remember.
Yes, I have some a really pertinent example here from Doctor Who. Is anyone familiar with the Weeping Angels episode, the famous Weeping Angels episodes?
Yes.
So in case anyone is listening...
I like where you're going, but I just want to say for the moment, curiosity killed the cat after all, but cats do have 9 lives.
Like that.
For all of you numerology fans out there, you'll get what I'm saying.
Okay. So very quickly, I'll try to brief. And for the listeners who don't know Doctor Who, this was a so-called cheap episode. They wanted to have a monster, but they didn't have budgets for it. So in Doctor Who, they created like a statue and they made up some science mumbo jumbo that it was like in a quantum state. And so it held the hands before the eyes, and it was to protect its vision, because when someone looked at it, it was stone. But when someone was not looking at it, it was in another quantum mumbo jumbo state, and thereby it could move. So the whole point is that you had to look at it in order for it to be stone. And if you didn't, it could move and it would then eat and kill you, basically. And they protected themselves by holding the hands above their eyes so they didn't look at each other, turning each other's to stone. And this has become like one of the most popular episodes of Doctor Who ever. Like, it's incredibly popular. And I believe that it's because it's touched upon an incredibly important archetype that it goes way beyond Doctor Who, and that it wasn't planned at all. It just happened to strike gold. And it goes to the same stuff that goes with Medusa, looking at Medusa, and you're turning to stone. It's like the Medusa in reverse. And so it's a warning about curiosity, about you should be careful about what you cut, at what you look at, because looking is cutting, right? Be careful what you look at, be careful what you cut into, because what you cut may turn out to be something very dangerous. And this is what it's basically warning about. So when you
since we're on the topic of Medusa just for a moment, I do want to connect this to the story of Perseus and how his curiosity towards trying to change fate, which we could perhaps say is the pattern here, also has ramifications. But please continue.
So I'm not saying that we shouldn't do science or we shouldn't do cutting. Like, obviously, cutting is very good when it's applied correctly, but you should do it with care, because you're playing with fire. Like fire, the eyes, the eye, the consciousness, that's light, like shining a light on things. And when you shine a light on things, light, according to Pageau, is the same thing as fire, because in the ancient time, light came from fire. So light and fire are the same symbolically. And when you play with fire, when you play with fire when you shine light upon things, because that is cutting into things, and you don't know what happens. It can have undesirable and unpredictable consequences. It will have.
John, just a quick reminder for me. Don't you have a degree in physics?
Yes, I do.
I just wanted to make that clear to the audience. So when John says physics mumbo jumbo, he actually knows what he's talking about. Just in case anybody... Yeah, he's not denigrating physics here.
No. What I mean by that is, like, in the Doctor Who story, it puts together some mumbo jumbo that isn't really physics but sounds physicsy. So yeah,
right. But I just wanted to highlight the fact that you actually have some authority to make a determination of that nature. And I also just I know we got to wrap it up at some point here, hopefully soon. I just wanted to say thank you for the nature nurture thing. I don't know why I never saw that, but that was super fantastically useful. So this is why I've enjoyed talking to you.
If I'm understanding the specific connection point here, John, is the eye that turns things into stone, or rather that eyes can turn things into stone, which when they are not looking at them are moving and in motion.
So stone is dead, right?
Right. Am I correctly identifying that as to why you brought up this specific episode?
Yes, it's like when you look at something, stone in this case is inert, it's dead, it's not alive.
It's not moving, right?
It's not moving. And so, in other words, when in this case, it is an inversion of the Medusa story, which makes it very, very interesting, because I mean, in an inversion story isn't necessarily evil by itself, depends on what it's inverting. So, but in this case, you keep something dead by looking at it, but by starting to look at it, you're stirring its attention. Like it's noticing that statue is alive, but you're keeping it dead by sticking in your eyes into it. But it's noticing your curiosity and is turning its attention towards you. Another movie, or like popular art, that does the same trick as Doctor Who is one of my favorite movies is Inception. Inception, the movie. In Inception, you go into the mind and you start manipulating things. And the whole thing is that when you manipulate the mind, the unconscious starts to notice you after a while, because you're cutting into someone else's mind. So in the movie,
also levering.
Yeah. Well, okay. That yes. But
because and this will be important later, because I'll bring up perhaps in another session when we were looking at the tripartite diagram earlier. the inversion point at one of the specific nodes is what Inception is doing, in as much as it's trying to cut in and then lever something.
Yes. Now, but my point is, in the movie, in Inception, you can actually see what that when they're in the mind, people start turning toward them, like discovering that they are there, because they're probing a place they shouldn't be. And the unconscious is starting to discover them. And the unconscious is feminine, right? It's nature. Consciousness is masculine. The unconscious is feminine. So in one sense, that is precisely the story of Doctor Who, where you're starting to poke into nature. And when you're doing that, nature starts waking up to you and shifts its attention to you. Like it has severe consequences. And
for folks in the audience, I'd also recommend the second time that the Weeping Angels appear. This would make sense in context, but they appear in both the 10th Doctor and the 11th Doctor. But the specific dynamic of how, like, what and who and how the angels are is placed in a different context with ramifications that fleshes out a little bit of what you're talking about the unconscious noticing you, because someone does look them in the eye in the 11th Doctor, but not to give away any spoilers.
Yes. So brilliant point. But my only point here is that these stories that deal with this, when they become very popular, they're a sign that there's something archetypical going on, which is why the Bible has survived. And in this case, it's a story about curiosity. And like curiosity isn't evil, but it is dangerous, and you should treat it as such. It is a knife, and you should treat knives with extreme caution.
So,
yeah, this is something that, especially as I'm 31 now, I'm starting to understand some of these things more deeply in life. But like, when you engage in conceptualization processes and form a concept in your head, it really shapes you. I mean, yesterday Mark talked about cognitive overload, which is, in my opinion, one of maybe your best work to me, but I'm also most interested in that subject, but some of his best work. And there's more that could be said, but it's very easy to become a clanging cymbal. And when you place your attention on things, you become what you place your attention on. Like in the parking lot, I had a parking lot conversation the other day with this girl that was in therapy for 13 years, and like, I don't know what, it's like, if you're in therapy for 13 years, there's something to be said about, being a self-help junkie, right? Like, there's an amount of introspection and certain processes that can help, but at some point, by placing your focus on certain things, you grow them bigger. And this, I could talk about this all day. I'm very interested in the subjects of the mind, like John mentioned the unconscious, but it's a big deal, and it doesn't get. Chris, thank you. Anyway, that's all I had to say for the most part. But but basically, to wrap up, like, when you hear aphorisms like "hear no evil, see no evil, speak no evil," as you get older, you'll start to realize that there's a big deal. Like, what your parents told you, you're not able to fully understand it until you get older. And as you get older, you start to realize, like, man, windows start to close, and you start to become formed in ways that it's better an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, maybe more.
If I could share a quick light joke, not even a joke, actually, an anecdote to that point, Danny. When I was a young child, my father once told me, when I was looking for something, two things: go back to where you were, and it's always in the last place you look. And it wasn't until I was much older that I understood that was definitionally true. That whatever it is that you're looking for is always in the last place that you look when you found it, and that is a dynamical representation of what I heard you speaking towards.
Very nice. I also have a joke. It's an aphorism about aphorism, and the aphorism is that an aphorism is a joke that isn't funny.
Yeah, anti-humor is actually quite fun.
Aphorisms summarize things in a slogan, and so they do the same things as a joke does, because a joke basically summarizes a situation, but An aphorism does so without it being humorous. So humor has to contain a contradiction, whereas an aphorism doesn't.
Okay, let's. I want to close this up. Christopher, you want to say something? Or?
Oh, no, sorry, I was just jumping back in. Sorry, I had to leave and go help my mother-in-law solve a few problems, but.
Yeah, so I want to wrap things up. I want to have one clarification. RJ, did you mean lever as in making things work for your purpose? Is that the
No,
way
I
that you
mean
use it?
lever in the sense of in the same way that a knife, when cutting, uses a point and then applies pressure.
Right.
A lever applies pressure across a different axis, and the knife can be used to do that.
Okay. Yes. Okay.
In an aphoristic sense, that can be that has implications, and we can discuss that on the back channel.
Yeah. Let's just close it up. I want to give Christopher, I think afterwards, because he was still in a point and maybe he was feeling incomplete around that. But I want to wrap it a little bit up. Write down your own intention for the week. Because we went through a lot, also through little pages, which is probably a good sign, because then that means that there's a bunch of inspiration and relating to at least things that are high in our hierarchy. But it also, we might also get distracted or ahead of ourselves in the sense that we haven't laid enough groundwork that will be there later in the book, so that we can just like reference that when we're trying to get deeper into these ideas. So maybe we need to also practice some patience instead of curiosity. I want to invite everybody to do the integration, those things, and I'll wrap up the stream. So please tune in next time. We'll be going on from chapter 19 and we'll read till chapter 25. So